In the final year of World War II, the dense mountainous jungles of northern Burma became the stage for some of the least understood operations of the Allied campaign in Southeast Asia. Few today realize that entire sections of these forests remained unmapped even in 1944, despite years of British colonial presence. It was into this very terrain, harsh, humid, and unforgiving, that the British Indian 77th Brigade, better known as the Chindits, established a string of forward-listening posts designed to monitor the shifting strength of the Japanese 15th Army. One of these posts, perched on a ridge west of the Salween River, would soon become the origin point of a mystery that has lingered for over 8 decades. Life at the outpost was defined by isolation. Supplies arrived by airdrop when weather allowed, and mail, when it came at all, arrived weeks out of date. The men stationed there, a rotating detachment drawn from the 2nd Battalion of the Burma Regiment, lived with the knowledge that they were operating at the furthest edge of Allied reach. Their shelters were built from bamboo and scavenged timber. Their radio mast rose like a skeletal branch above the canopy. They operated under a simple but dangerous directive: track Japanese patrols attempting to infiltrate the valleys north of Lashio, and report anything unusual immediately. The struggle wasn't only military. Jungle rot ate through boots in days. Malaria, dysentery, and leeches were constant companions. A British medical officer later wrote in a unit diary, "The jungle is a more consistent enemy than any soldier wearing a uniform. It never stops. It never relents." For the men of the outpost, silence itself could feel threatening. Even the wind seemed muffled by the dense teak and bamboo, leaving the impression of being sealed off from the rest of the world. Yet the strategic stakes were clear. With the Japanese holding strong defensive positions across central Burma, Allied commanders needed to dismantle their supply routes and gain intelligence on their hidden movements. The Chindits, operating behind enemy lines with long-range penetration tactics, relied heavily on field intelligence gathered by small, unsung units like this one. The outpost became a node in a fragile chain of communication feeding into General Slim's broader strategy for Operation Thursday, the 1944 push to retake northern Burma. By early March, Japanese activity had intensified along the ridge trails east of the post. Tracks appeared where none had existed the week before. Fresh ration tins were found near a streambed. On March 10th, a message from brigade headquarters arrived: possible enemy buildup near Sector Green 4. Confirm presence. Report movements. The order was clear, but ambiguous enough to raise concern among the outpost's senior NCOs. Intelligence from Chinese nationalist scouts operating further east had hinted at small but mobile Japanese detachments probing for weak points in Allied lines. Still, the patrol had to be launched. On the morning of March 12, 1944, 8 men assembled near the clearing that served as the post's parade ground. Their equipment was standard for reconnaissance: Lee Enfield rifles, 1 Bren gun, 2 wireless sets, 1 short-range, 1 long-range, a compass, machetes, and limited rations. Their commander, Lieutenant Arthur Malloy, was only 22 but seasoned by months in the field. Witnesses later recalled him briefing his men quietly, pointing at a marked ridge on a tattered map spread across an ammunition crate. A corporal from the signal section later noted in his logbook, "Lieutenant Malloy confident. Men prepared. Weather unstable. Expect rain." Within the hour, the patrol filed into the trees and disappeared into the humid green darkness. The outpost returned to its routine, monitoring the wireless, scanning the valley, maintaining the perimeter. But something was different that day. The weather began to shift by afternoon, the sky dimming under a thick bank of monsoon cloud. By evening the first message came through, weak, distorted. Malloy's voice, barely audible beneath static, mentioned encountering signs of movement and possible enemy trail markings. Then, abruptly, the transmission cut off. The radio operator tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, adjusting frequency and antenna direction. Nothing. The jungle, once oppressive in its silence, now felt ominous. A sergeant later recalled, it was like the trees themselves closed around them. One moment they were there. Then, nothing. That night, rain hammered the outpost. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The patrol was overdue for its scheduled signals check, but no one could determine whether it was malfunction, weather, or something else. The officers debated sending a rescue team immediately, but the storm made movement impossible. By dawn, only one thing was certain: the patrol had not returned. And as the men prepared to search for their missing comrades, they could not know that the clues they would find would deepen the mystery rather than explain it, setting the stage for one of the most puzzling disappearances of the Burma campaign. In the jungles of northern Burma, even the simplest operation could unfold into something far more dangerous than expected. The patrol that left the outpost on March 12, 1944 was meant to follow a predictable pattern: advance along a known hunter's trail, survey several ridge crests suspected of hosting Japanese supply caches, and return within a day. British planners routinely relied on these small reconnaissance teams, especially from the Burma Regiment, whose soldiers were intimately familiar with the land's rhythms. But the patrol led by Lieutenant Arthur Malloy quickly became an example of how the Burma campaign respected no plan, no matter how carefully laid. From the moment they stepped off, the terrain began asserting its dominance. Northern Burma's jungles were a maze of narrow footpaths and steep gradients, where a map was as much a prayer as a tool. The men moved cautiously, boots sinking into the sponge-like earth, machetes cutting through creeping vines. Malloy kept the column tight, one Bren gunner toward the rear, a radio man positioned close to him, and scouts ahead checking for signs of enemy movement. The temperature climbed relentlessly. Though it was only mid-March, the humidity was already building toward monsoon levels. The Japanese 15th Army had long exploited these same trails, slipping small patrols through breaks in the canopy to probe Allied positions. For weeks, scouts from the 20th Indian Infantry Division had reported unusual signs: fresh-cut bamboo, fires still smoldering, boot prints inconsistent with local guerrillas. That morning, Malloy's team found their first confirmation. In the mud along a narrow pass, Private Singh spotted a line of impressions, the distinctive tread pattern of Japanese toby boots. They were less than 24 hours old. Such discoveries brought a mix of relief and unease. Intelligence was the mission, and this was precisely the kind of evidence Brigade Headquarters sought. Yet finding it meant the enemy was close, possibly watching them even now. The patrol pressed onward, choosing silence over speed, each man adjusting to the sense that an invisible perimeter had begun closing around them. By midday the sky darkened, the first sign of the tropical storm that would soon engulf the region. Malloy paused the patrol beneath the shelter of a massive teak tree so the wireless operator could attempt a short-range transmission. The signal crackled weakly, but headquarters confirmed receipt. Malloy's brief message was simple: track activity confirmed. Proceeding east. Will update. It would be his last clear transmission. The rain struck without warning, thick, punishing sheets that drowned sound and erased tracks. Trails transformed into mud channels. Compass readings became unreliable under the dense canopy, distorted by the iron-rich soil beneath the surface. The patrol's pace slowed dramatically. Even experienced Burmese soldiers struggled to maintain orientation. Lieutenant Malloy, normally steady and self-assured, consulted his map more frequently, checking and rechecking bearings he no longer trusted. As the storm intensified, the radio operator attempted another update. This time the signal broke apart in a wash of static before fading entirely. The long-range set, heavy, temperamental, and sensitive to moisture, was struggling. The men sheltered temporarily beneath an outcropping, catching their breath while Malloy reviewed their options. The objective lay at least 2 kilometers ahead, but the weather, and the sense of unseen movement in the forest, raised doubts about continuing. A section journal recovered months later from the abandoned outpost included an entry from the radio corporal describing this moment. Lieutenant Malloy, reluctant to turn back, said the signs were too fresh, too important. Believes Japanese may be preparing for a local push. The men trusted him. Malloy had proven calm under pressure before. So they pushed deeper into the forest's churning green darkness. By late afternoon, the storm reached its peak. Light vanished beneath the canopy. Some soldiers reported hearing branches snap in the distance, one direction, then another, as though multiple groups were moving around them. But no shapes emerged, no voices carried through the rain. Even the Bren gunner, seasoned and unflappable, admitted later that the silence felt unnatural. As dusk approached, the patrol reached a narrow saddle between two ridgelines. This was the place where, according to the logbook entry discovered later, the final radio message was attempted. Malloy's report came through faintly at the outpost, a distorted fragment mentioning enemy ahead and lost direction. It was impossible to tell whether he meant they had sighted Japanese troops or sensed them nearby. Moments later the signal collapsed. Back at the outpost, the radio operator tried repeatedly to raise them, cycling through frequencies, adjusting the antenna mast, even tapping the side of the set in frustration. Nothing. The atmosphere inside the bamboo operations shelter shifted from routine discomfort to a growing sense of dread. Everyone knew that silence in the jungle rarely meant safety. Night closed in quickly. With the storm still raging, no rescue party could be dispatched. All the men at the outpost could do was wait and hope for a flicker of signal or the distant echoes of returning footsteps. Neither came. The patrol had moved into the heart of the storm, and it seemed, into the heart of something far more complex. By morning, they would be overdue. By evening, presumed in danger. And within 24 hours, the first signs discovered by the rescue team would raise questions no one in the brigade could answer. At dawn on March 13, 1944, the storm that had battered the hills finally weakened, leaving behind a jungle transformed into a sodden tangle of mist and dripping branches. Back at the outpost, the men emerged from their makeshift shelters hoping the airwaves might clear enough for a signal. But the wireless set remained dead, no acknowledgement, no return call, not even the faint pulse of static that sometimes hinted at a distant, struggling transmission. Lieutenant Malloy's patrol had been expected to check in before first light. The silence now felt heavy, deliberate, almost sentient. A decision was made just after 0700 hours. A four-man team from the 77th Brigade's local headquarters would begin a search, moving along the same outbound trail the patrol had taken the morning before. Their orders were straightforward: locate the patrol or locate trace evidence, then report back immediately. Leading the group was Sergeant Harold Atkins, a veteran of earlier Arakan campaigns, who knew all too well how quickly a simple reconnaissance mission could unravel in the Burmese interior. The journey began uneventfully. The first 100 meters showed nothing unusual, just churned mud and broken foliage where the patrol had passed. But less than half a kilometer in, Private Collins noticed something half submerged in a patch of red clay. A boot, upright, laces intact, as if someone had stepped neatly out of it. The discovery felt surreal. There was no sign of struggle, no drag marks, no blood, no scattered equipment. The footprint ended abruptly beside the boot, like a sentence cut off mid-word. Sergeant Atkins ordered the men to fan out in a narrow semicircle. They searched the immediate area, checking behind fallen logs, under thickets of cane, and between exposed root systems. But the jungle floor, churned by the storm, held no other clear impressions. Collins, normally talkative, avoided eye contact. "No one," he whispered, "just leaves a boot like that. Not in this." The team pressed onward. Roughly 20 minutes later, they made another discovery. Caught on a low branch and stretched tightly between two ferns was a length of field telephone wire, the type used by Allied units to maintain communication over short distances. But the wire had been severed cleanly, the frayed end coiled slightly as if it had snapped under tension. The line vanished into a thicket that led downslope into a ravine. Again, the absence of surrounding disturbance was unsettling. In typical battlefield conditions, a broken line would be surrounded by footprints, drag marks, or discarded equipment from hurried field repairs. Here, there was nothing. The psychological weight of these findings began to seep into the team. Atkins maintained discipline, but he admitted later in a post-war interview that the jungle felt tight, too quiet, like we were walking inside a closed fist. He ordered the men to maintain close formation from that point onward. The last thing he wanted was to create a second disappearance while searching for the first. As the terrain grew more difficult, the team encountered fresh indicators that the patrol's final hours had been chaotic. A machete dent in a tree trunk suggested someone had slashed at the foliage roughly, perhaps in haste. A strip of cloth, likely from a torn haversack, hung from a thorn. But there were no shell casings, no bloodstains, no evidence of Japanese contact. The findings raised more questions than answers. By midday, the team halted near a large rock formation used previously as a navigational marker. Atkins checked his notebook, cross-referencing locations reported by Malloy's earlier transmissions. Based on the timeline and terrain, the missing patrol should have passed this area around the time their final garbled message had been received at the outpost. The sergeant noted the eerie alignment, the place where orientation was lost, the place where radio contact faded, and now the place where the trail effectively disappeared. The insight struck him hard. He had participated in rescue operations before, searching for men lost to ambushes, tiger attacks, even river drownings. All left evidence. But this scenario felt different. Whatever happened to Malloy's patrol had unfolded without leaving the signatures typically associated with enemy action or natural accident. Instead, the jungle presented only faint, inconsistent traces, as though the men had been walking through multiple overlapping paths and at some point simply stopped leaving tracks. The rescue party pressed farther east, but by late afternoon, visibility began to falter again as fog drifted between the ridgelines. Atkins made the difficult call to return to the outpost before nightfall. The risk of the rescuers themselves becoming disoriented was too great. Before turning back, he marked the last known sign of the patrol with a strip of white cloth and a note pinned beneath a stone. Coordinates, bearing, time. As they retraced their steps, none of the men spoke much. Even the natural chorus of cicadas and birds seemed muted. They arrived at the outpost exhausted, drenched, and troubled. Their report was blunt and unsettling. The patrol's trail existed, until it didn't. And the few objects they had found raised more questions than they answered. What had happened after the final radio call? Why was there so little evidence of confrontation? And how could 8 trained soldiers vanish in an area that should have held clearer signs of their movement? These questions now weighed heavily on the officers at brigade headquarters. Questions that would drive the increasingly desperate search that followed. By the morning of March 14, 1944, the disappearance of Lieutenant Malloy's 8-man patrol had shifted from concern to alarm. The initial search team's findings, an abandoned boot, a severed line, and scattered fragments of gear, circulated rapidly through the command chain of the 77th Brigade. These were not the signs of an ordinary ambush, nor of a routine patrol gone astray. Something about the pattern felt incomplete, as though the story the jungle was offering had missing chapters. Brigade headquarters responded by authorizing an expanded search operation, drawing additional men from the nearby elements of the British 20th Indian Infantry Division who were operating several miles to the southwest. At first light, 2 new teams set out, each comprising a mix of Gurkha riflemen, Burmese scouts, and Chindit veterans familiar with the unpredictable terrain. Their objective was simple, though the path ahead was not: follow the faint remnants of the patrol's trail beyond the last marker Sergeant Atkins had placed the day before. Heavy fog still clung to the valley floors, and the air remained saturated after the previous day's storm, but the urgency of the mission pressed the searchers onward. The forest canopy muffled their footsteps as they advanced in tight formation. The terrain grew more uneven, with steep inclines that forced the men to climb hand over foot through slick mud. Moving through these conditions tested even the Gurkhas, whose mountain training usually gave them an advantage. Here, the jungle negated any sense of familiarity. The search teams had expected at minimum a broken branch here, a rifle cartridge there, something unambiguously tied to the missing patrol's passage. But the deeper they pressed, the stranger the terrain felt. Roughly 1 hour into the search, they discovered another fragment of evidence. A mess tin lay upside down beside a narrow runoff channel, its surface dented but otherwise intact. The markings, AM, scratched faintly into the metal, identified it as Lieutenant Malloy's. Yet once again there were no supporting tracks, no gouged earth, no blood. The object seemed simply placed. The discovery unsettled the men. A Burmese scout murmured, He would not have left this. No one disagreed. From this point forward, the search effort began taking on the tone of an investigation rather than a rescue. The teams documented their findings carefully, marking grid coordinates and recording the exact orientation of every discovered item. A Chindik captain, reviewing the observations in real time, remarked that the dispersed evidence felt as though the jungle swallowed the men, but spat out their belongings in confusion. Shortly past midday, the teams reached the saddle ridge that Malloy's patrol had intended to cross before scouting the supply drop zone. This was an important waypoint, a strategic choke point that Japanese forces occasionally used as a concealed observation platform. If the patrol had been ambushed anywhere, this location was a likely candidate. But what the searchers found defied familiar patterns. On the eastern edge of the saddle, they located a shallow depression in the earth, likely where someone had knelt or fallen. Beside it lay a cracked wireless handset, its rubber casing torn open as if struck against stone. Yet again, there were no shell casings, no bullet strikes on nearby trees, no footprints indicating struggle, drag, or flight. The team moved slowly outward in overlapping spirals, expecting to encounter bodies or at least abandoned equipment. They found neither. One Gurkha sergeant noted quietly, if the Japanese had taken them, there would be signs. Always signs. Indeed, Japanese ambush techniques, though often swift and precise, typically left telltale indicators. Spent ammunition, broken brush from sudden movement, sometimes the discarded wrappings of rations consumed while waiting in cover. The absence of any such clues made the possibility of enemy involvement murky at best. By late afternoon, the search extended into a narrow ravine choked with elephant grass and bamboo thickets. The teams advanced cautiously, aware that the thick undergrowth could hide anything, from a concealed Japanese marksman to a washed-out gully. Visibility dropped to mere feet. When they reached the far side of the ravine, the terrain opened slightly into a small clearing formed by the collapse of an old teak tree. There, half hidden beneath a cluster of ferns, lay the most puzzling object yet, a field notebook, its pages damp but still legible. Inside, the writing was unmistakable. Lieutenant Malloy's hand, neat and methodical. The final entry read, "Sighted movement along Eastern Trail. Confirmed unfamiliar tracks. Attempting alternate route." The time noted beside the message matched almost exactly the moment the Outpost received Malloy's last faint transmission. This discovery should have clarified the sequence of events, yet it only deepened the mystery. Malloy's words implied decision, direction, and awareness. But the trails around the clearing showed nothing. No impressions, no continued route, no evidence of the patrol progressing or withdrawing. As evening approached, the officers leading the search faced a bitter dilemma. The light was fading, and conditions were too dangerous to continue. The jungle did not forgive after dark. They marked the clearing and withdrew, planning to return at first light with a larger force. When the teams finally reached the outpost, carrying Malloy's notebook, the atmosphere was unmistakably grim. The search had revealed pieces, objects scattered like breadcrumbs, but no pattern that pointed to a fate. The men were neither found nor accounted for. No battle had occurred, yet something had clearly happened. The mystery was tightening around the brigade. And by the next morning, the search would transform from a recovery effort into one of the most perplexing investigations of the entire Burma campaign. By March 15, 1944, the disappearance of Lieutenant Malloy's patrol had become one of the most pressing operational concerns within the northern sector of the Burma theater. The absence of bodies, the inexplicable placement of personal items, and the lack of any discernible combat traces forced brigade leadership to consider a much wider search. Messages were sent to nearby formations of 4 Corps, and elements of the British 20th Indian Infantry Division, already pushing east toward the Swili River, were asked to divert personnel to assist. Within hours, search parties that once numbered a dozen now grew into coordinated sweeps of more than 50 men, divided into smaller teams that moved along intersecting grid lines. These new groups brought with them not only reinforcements but experience. The 20th Indian Division had spent much of early 1944 in arduous jungle operations and was intimately familiar with the patterns that shaped Japanese patrol behavior. As they pushed into the rugged folds around the outpost, they expected to find at least some standard markers of enemy presence. Instead, the jungle revealed almost nothing. The first day of expanded searching yielded little beyond what was already known. The patrol's trail faded into ambiguity near the ridge saddle, as if the men had become disordered or split unexpectedly. But no alternate trails showed consistent movement, just intermittent depressions in soft earth, broken in irregular directions, as though the patrol had moved with mounting confusion. This concerned the officers. Experienced soldiers seldom wandered without purpose. Even under duress, trained units left deliberate, directional indicators. Here, the indicators contradicted one another. As the teams pushed farther east, they entered terrain few Allied units had ever navigated. Towering cliffs rose sporadically from the jungle floor, and the monsoon-swollen tributaries carved deep gullies that forced frequent detours. The searchers moved carefully, all too aware that a single misstep could send a man sliding down hidden banks into dense underbrush. Yet even in these treacherous conditions, they uncovered no sign of mass movement, no discarded equipment, no hastily dug fighting positions, no remains. Sergeant Gurung, leading one of the Gurkha elements, later wrote, "It was as though the ground had been wiped clean." Around midday, one team discovered what they hoped might be a breakthrough, a collapsed section of bamboo lattice that suggested temporary cover had been erected, possibly by the missing patrol. But closer inspection revealed older signs: weathered edges, rotting leaf bindings. It was not recent and not connected to Malloy's men. The disappointment spread through the ranks, demonstrating how hunger for answers can distort the weight of faint clues. The search widened further. Additional personnel from the 20th Indian Division's 100th Brigade, operating behind the Chindits as logistical support, were tasked with covering the lower slopes along the ravines. These soldiers, Indians, Burmese, and British officers together, scoured the bases of cliffs for signs of accidental falls. They found nothing. Not even a rifle sling or helmet strap. For seasoned infantrymen, the absence became increasingly difficult to rationalize. By late afternoon, the search coordinators began cross-referencing possible enemy activity with recently gathered signals intelligence. For several days, Allied listening posts had intercepted minor Japanese broadcasts discussing movements along secondary trails, but none mentioned ambushes, prisoner captures, or engagements with British reconnaissance units. While Japanese records were not always reliable, the silence on their end supported the uneasy theory forming among the officers that the patrol had not encountered a conventional enemy force. Still, to rule nothing out, the searchers pressed northward toward a series of ridgelines where Japanese snipers had been known to operate. Here the forest grew thinner, and the ground became more navigable. Yet this clarity only accentuated the mystery. If the patrol had fled in panic or attempted evasive maneuvers, their passage through these exposed areas should have left clear, readable signatures. Again, the teams found none. A Chindit captain summarized the situation in his field report that evening. 8 men cannot simply disappear. They leave tracks. They leave effects. They leave the marks of movement. Here we find indications, but never continuity. His phrasing captured the feeling shared across the brigade. The jungle offered fragments, but never a narrative. By twilight, the search parties began regrouping along a shallow tributary west of the initial trail. The area provided a temporary staging ground, a rare open stretch where they could rest, boil water, review maps, and plan the next day's sweep. Sitting along the muddy bank, the officers examined their notes from the past 48 hours. 3 items, found miles apart, belonged undeniably to Malloy's patrol. Yet not one item pointed conclusively toward what had befallen them. Night in northern Burma descends quickly, and by 1900 hours the darkness had thickened into an impenetrable curtain. With the canopy overhead, even moonlight struggled to infiltrate. The men of the search units lay in uneasy rest, listening to the rustle of branches and the occasional distant cry of an unseen animal. The jungle seemed to close in, not hostile, but indifferent, as if whatever had happened here was long finished and no longer belonged to the living world. Back at the outpost, commanders faced a grim truth. They could not maintain such large search operations indefinitely. Supplies were finite, manpower stretched, and the advance towards central Burma demanded attention. But the absence of answers weighed heavily. No officer wanted to abandon the search, not without some explanation for the disappearance. The next day would bring the largest sweep yet, crossing deeper into terrain few Allied soldiers had ever set foot upon. And it would bring the final haunting realization that some wartime mysteries yield no closure at all. By March 16, 1944, the search for Lieutenant Malloy's patrol reached its final and most extensive phase. At dawn, more than 70 men, drawn from the Chindits, the 20th Indian Infantry Division, and local Kachin scouts, assembled in the wet, mist-covered clearing below the outpost. The jungle around them steamed from the night's humidity, and a tense quiet settled over the formation. Everyone knew this would be the last day they could commit such numbers. The demands of the wider Burma campaign were growing, and brigade headquarters insisted that the lines of advance could not stall. What happened today would determine whether the search would continue or conclude without answers. The officers divided the force into 4 sweep lines stretching nearly a kilometer wide. The plan was simple: move east and south along overlapping arcs, covering the last unsearched pockets of jungle and ravine where the patrol might have strayed, been ambushed, or taken refuge. But the deeper the men went, the more the jungle resisted. Razor-edged elephant grass cut at their uniforms. Narrow chasms forced detours that disrupted their carefully plotted grid. Clusters of bamboo grew so densely that even the Gurkhas, accustomed to moving swiftly through difficult terrain, were slowed. Around mid-morning, one of the southern teams made a discovery that briefly reignited hope. Half hidden beneath rotting leaves lay a single .303 cartridge, unfired, of the same type issued to Malloy's men. But hopes dimmed quickly. The casing showed signs of age, its surface tarnished, its rim corroded. It was impossible to link the round definitively to the missing patrol. Ammunition of that type littered the Burma front. It could just as easily have belonged to a unit from earlier months. Still, the find pushed the men onward. Every hint, every scrap, felt like momentum. Farther north, the terrain sharpened into a series of ridges veined with narrow game trails. These trails, well known to the Kachin scouts, were often used by smugglers, hunters, and occasionally Japanese reconnaissance teams. If Malloy's patrol had turned here, either by choice or disorientation, there was a chance they had followed one of these paths into the high ground. The searchers fanned out along the ridge, studying the soil for impressions, blades of grass for bends, the bark of trees for recent cuts. But the ridge offered nothing new. No tracks. No discarded gear. No sign of campfire ash. If the patrol had come this way, the jungle had already reclaimed every trace. By early afternoon, the largest sweep line descended into a valley shaped by an old landslide. The terrain was jagged and unpredictable, with boulders slick from the previous day's rain. It was here that the final, most haunting discovery of the entire search was made. Resting in a shallow pool, partly obscured by moss and watergrass, lay a single metal object, the brass cap of a British field compass. The cap's serial number matched the one assigned to the patrol's senior scout, Corporal Myers. But again, as with every other clue, there was nothing else nearby. No footprints. No dragged earth. No snapped twigs. The compass cap appeared alone, out of context, as though placed or dropped without any surrounding signs of human passage. When Sergeant Garoon crouched beside it, he said softly, "Everything we find is by itself. Nothing connects." The deeper implication hit the officers hard. The scattered evidence, Malloy's mess tin, the torn handset, the lone boot, and now the compass cap, formed a pattern not of struggle or ambush, but of isolation. Each item existed as a fragment, severed from a larger story that refused to reveal itself. Even in war, where chaos is constant, disappearances usually leave a trail. Here, there was only silence. As the sun dipped low and the light thinned beneath the canopy, the officers gathered near the valley floor. After 4 days of exhaustive searching, they had to accept what none wished to acknowledge. The men were gone. Not captured, No Japanese records ever alluded to prisoners from a British patrol in this area. Not ambushed. No signs of combat had ever been found. Not lost. 8 trained soldiers did not collectively walk to their deaths without leaving tracks. Brigade headquarters received the final assessment by radio. Search inconclusive. No surviving personnel located. No evidence of enemy engagement. Recommend withdrawal. Within 24 hours, the search was officially terminated. The outpost itself was abandoned shortly afterward. As the front line moved south toward Mandalay and Mykdala, small, isolated listening posts like this were deemed unnecessary. The bamboo huts collapsed in the following months, and the jungle swallowed the rest. By 1945, the outpost existed only in blurred recollections and fading grid markings on wartime maps. In the years after the war, historians attempting to reconstruct the incident faced the same obstacles as the searchers: fragmentary evidence, incomplete unit diaries, and no definitive enemy reports. A handful of veterans offered their theories: disorientation, a fall into a hidden ravine, a sudden encounter with a Japanese patrol that left no survivors, but none matched the inexplicable absence of physical traces. Modern researchers sometimes trek through the region with GPS equipment and high-resolution mapping tools. Some find remnants of rusted ammunition or shrapnel from unrelated engagements. Others report the faint outlines of trenches built by Allied units decades before. But no one has ever located a body, a weapon, or a mass site that could be tied to Malloy's patrol. What remains is a wartime mystery framed by hard facts. 8 men entered the jungle on March 12, 1944. They were seen, heard, and tracked for part of that first day. After that, the forest kept its secrets. And in the long memory of the Burma campaign, with its brutal terrain, hidden trails, and countless unnamed casualties, the story of the patrol that walked into darkness endures as one of its quietest, most unsettling enigmas.